Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Dark Tales, Volume 2, Story Number 1. Back when I was a young, broke college student, a friend and I thought we had stumbled upon the deal of a lifetime. A huge 5-bedroom house with 2 bathrooms for dirt cheap rent. The house was in a kind of out-of-the-way place in Virginia, but it suited our needs, and the rent was unbelievably cheap. Let me preface this by saying that in the Commonwealth of Virginia, there are no disclosure laws in real estate, meaning that the buyer or renter is not entitled to know the history of the house before signing on the dotted line. Within a month of moving into this house, odd things began happening. The electricity didn't work very well. At first, we attributed this to the fact that the house was very old, built in the early 1900s, and the most recent rewiring of the house had been done in the 50s. Also, the main breaker for the house was located outside in a barn that stood about 20 yards from the house itself and was connected by several crude-looking overhead wires. Whenever the breakers tripped, which was at least 4 times a week, we'd have to get the flashlight and go to the barn to flip them back on. The electricity wasn't the only problem. We had an answering machine that never recorded any messages. Sometimes the light would be blinking, and when we'd push play, it was nothing but static. This was before DVR, and we worked a lot of nights. So we would try to record our shows, but it never worked. Just static and white noise. We also found it odd that pictures never turned out in or around the house. We went through 13 rolls of film before finally giving up. The first time we realized that we were dealing with more than just bad wiring was approximately 4 weeks after we moved in. As we were heading to the garage, which was only accessible through the door in the kitchen or the heavy old automatic door outside, we came to a dead stop. There was a man standing in our garage. He just stood there and was completely oblivious when we screamed. My friend slammed the door and locked it and called out to the man that we had a gun and were calling the cops. She retrieved the said gun and we opened the door again. The man was gone. Just poof, vanished. As previously stated, there were only 2 ways in: door through the kitchen or automatic door outside. The automatic door was very noisy, so we would have heard it open, and we had been in the kitchen all morning, so there was no way he got out that way. We were baffled, but went about life like normal. That incident seemed to open the floodgates, because after that it really became obvious. We were dealing with something not of this world. We used to hear the sound of a baby crying, followed by the sound of a rocking chair up in the attic. We investigated and found nothing. Certain spots would always remain cold. Cold is not something you come across in Virginia in the summer. Numerous times we woke up to find all the contents of the pantry on the floor. There were dozens of other odd things that happened, but I'm just highlighting some of the more bizarre occurrences. As things began to escalate, we got more and more nervous. The pinnacle was when we were sitting in the kitchen one evening, playing cards and waiting for some guests to arrive. Naturally, the lights went out, so we went out to trip the breaker. When we came out of the barn, we saw our friend running up the steps of the porch with a baseball bat. When we asked what he was doing, he told us that he saw a man standing in our living room, then walk up the stairs. Scared, we crowded behind him and searched the house with a bat and a gun. Nothing. About 2 weeks after that, my roommate's boss asked her why she never returned his call about switching a shift. She said she hadn't gotten any messages, and he proceeded to tell her about the man that answered the phone and told her we were out. Upon further investigation, we discovered that several other people had the same experience when they called. We were thoroughly freaked out by this time, so we decided to ask some of the town's residents about the house. We found out that the house was always vacant within 6 months of it being rented out. Although we were scared, we still stayed because of how cheap it was. One evening, we were in the living room watching TV when we heard a huge thud against the basement door. When I say thud, I mean the whole wall shook and the door frame came loose. The door was locked, but we were scared and put a chair against it. We could hear growling on the other side and claws on the door. So we again got the gun. We figured at first that a wild animal must have gotten in there, so we went outside to check the entrance. It was bolted shut. We even checked the tiny windows. Nothing broken. We finally went back into the house and opened the basement door. Nothing there. I've never seen claw marks like that before or since. It was as if whatever had done it only had 3 toes. Besides, nothing that was indigenous to the area was 3-toed or could have gotten in there without opening the door or breaking the window. Not to mention, none of the local animals, say a bear, could have exerted that much force to warp a door frame. We moved a week later. We could never really come up with any idea of what happened in that house or why. To this day remains a mystery, and to this day nobody lives there for more than 6 months before leaving. Next story. I'll start by saying I don't really believe in ghosts. At best I'm agnostic because I don't even know what a ghost would look like, so who knows. When I was 8, I'm now 40. My mom remarried and we moved to a house next to a cemetery. I could see the closest graves out of my bedroom window. I didn't mind because I didn't believe in ghosts, and it was a beautiful, quiet landscape. One day, when I was about 11, I saw an old man in my backyard trimming the brush at the back of our lawn. I adore old men and just thought it was a neighbor being kind, so I shot him a smile from my bedroom desk where I was doing my homework. He smiled back and waved, and I went back to work. The next day at school, my history teacher, he was from Wales, and was my favorite teacher ever because he picked up on the fact I had a British sense of humor, so we bonded. Asked me to stay after class. He knew I lived next to the cemetery and handed me a local news article about the groundskeeper having died a week earlier. He assumed I had known the guy and wanted to offer his condolences. The photo with the obituary was of the man I had seen in my backyard the day before. I have never figured out what the hell happened. I thought maybe the paper got the date of his death wrong, or maybe the guy had a twin brother who mistook our brush for part of the cemetery while taking over his brother's job. No clue. But I know what I saw. It was the same man, looking perfectly fine trimming our brush. Still no clue what that was. Next story. I thought I'd share some of my stories I've witnessed through my years of working as a janitor in the Pittsburgh region. I work for a company called ISS. I was stationed to work at several units, one of which troubled some of the other staff in the building. It was located at the RIDC Park. I won't mention the building number to keep it discreet. The building comprised 6 floors. The job was fairly typical for an office cleaning job, just mainly emptying trash, vacuuming, and mopping floors, with occasional dusting. We only had issues mainly on the 4th and 6th floors. Floor 2 and 5 were fairly straightforward. The only occurrences on the 6th floor involved moving objects and shadow people. A bit of a refresher on the shift. It was 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. Doors closed after 6. Building was only accessible via key and key card. Electronic locks. All office workers left at 6 p.m. Sometimes office workers would stay late, but it was noticeable as the offices and floors were small, and we would easily know if someone was still in the building. Mostly after 6, it was just me and 2 other workers going as quickly as possible to make it an easy night. Back to the occurrences on the 6th floor. There were times when working in the hall where people would walk past you that weren't there. They would turn a corner and disappear. The other workers and I experienced it often months apart. After it would happen, it would be a cause for alarm. We would check the security cameras and nothing would show. Just us working, often alone, or sometimes as a group, looking at things that weren't there. As far as moving objects on the 6th, there was one occurrence. The 2 other workers and myself were cleaning an office suite of a prominent company. We had notes to make sure it was perfect, as they had important meetings the next day. A pink feather duster was leaned up against the wall. Time was roughly 7 p.m. After emptying trash and wiping off countertops, all workers were present, no one left the room, and the entire floor was vacant. We couldn't find the feather duster. It wasn't a small object, and we were all aware of the building's tricks. We proceeded to check everywhere as a group. We opened adjacent suites, locked by key, with no avail. At this rate, we began to give up and decided to head down the elevator to the storage office on the first floor to acquire another duster. This required to go via the elevator. My coworker, Sam, hit the down button on the elevator, and after a short wait, the elevator arrived and the doors opened. Inside was the feather duster, hanging by the grate in the ceiling, which then fell to the floor. I froze, Sam screamed in shock, and our other cohort stared in disbelief. Needless to say, we stuck together as a team that night. Nothing else occurred. The fourth floor was a place of reappearing problems. It was also the largest floor, and no one liked working there. We often worked as a group. There was a main lobby, which was separated from a huge group of offices in a C formation, with a hallway in the same shape that wrapped around the floor. It was also a pain because of the lights shutting off at 7, and the lights were not able to be turned back on due to electronic overrides. In the winter months, this often led to us fumbling around in the dark, but since movement was often muscle memory, it wasn't much of an issue. We often heard disembodied footsteps on the floor. Radios in the offices would often go off on their own, which I presume to be some sort of interference, and once again moving objects and shadow people. The other workers often heard speech from the bathrooms, but after checking, no one was there. I only had one incident on the floor that I can't explain. I was working alone in the office section. We decided that the other two workers would clean the lobby and the bathrooms, and I would take the keys and key card to do the office loop. I had 2 rolls of 10-gallon trash bags and a 60-gallon bag to hold the smaller bags for easy cleanup. I did not have a trash can or anything else on me, and we decided not to vacuum that day. I've got quite a routine, and I can easily empty a bag and replace it in under 10 seconds, and then quickly move to the next office. I'm halfway through the loop, and yes, the lights are out, but I can still see the hallway clearly. They are empty and clear, no obstructions. As I finished one office and exited into the hallway, I collided with a large 60-gallon trash can, which made me jump. Keep in mind, I did not have a can. There was nothing there previously, and the joining hallway was roughly 5 feet wide. The can easily took up the hallway, and if anyone decided to spook me, they would be heard. I promptly headed to the lobby. The other workers were still in the bathroom cleaning. I asked, "Are you guys messing with me?" They replied, "No, we've been out here the whole time. What happened?" I tell them, and we went back to the spot as a group. The trash can is still there, and it's not even the one we owned. We ended up throwing it away in the dumpster behind the building. No one wanted anything to do with it. I also had the keys and key card, and the doors locked behind me. There was no way for them to reach me. No office workers were in the building, and the security tapes once again showed nothing. We finished up that night, creeped out, and ready to leave as soon as possible. We tried hiring other workers to assist, but due to the events, we had a fairly high turnover and transfer rate of new workers. We ended up staying with the building as a team of 3 until our contract with the owner terminated. Events were not predictable, sometimes with gaps stretching from days to months, with no rhyme or reason. Next story. I grew up in a suburb in Texas. It was on a prairie, and while it had a big population, due to the big cities that it was located near, it was actually a smaller sized town. Only 2 high schools, no hospital, and during the time I lived there, it didn't even have a clinic. First thing, there was a creek that ran near where I lived that seemed to spur all the urban legends. There was a twisty, narrow road in a bushy, woodsy area. This road had a bridge that went over the creek. It was said that a young couple were driving very fast down this road one rainy night, and their car went off the bridge. They did not have their seat belts on, so they went through the windshield and were decapitated. Their heads were never found. It was said on dark and rainy nights, if you went driving down that road, you would see a car racing past you and disappear before the bridge. I researched it when I was in high school, and I found one accident that did line up enough to maybe be linked. It was in the mid-'80s. Teenage couple had hydroplaned off the bridge and ran their car into the creek. No seatbelts, and the cause of death was blunt force trauma. They hadn't been decapitated, but it seemed to be the origin of the legend. The second urban legend Also was near this creek, just past the brush, was an empty field and a small group of houses. I had a friend who lived in those houses who said they'd get calls from some lady screaming in Spanish. This happened so often that her parents had the police get involved for what they thought was someone harassing them. The police tapped their phones to see where the calls were coming from, and they said the calls were coming from their house. They couldn't explain it. There was a rumor that those houses were built on top of what used to be the location of a Spanish mission that had burned down long, long ago. Next incident, it was in the empty field by those houses that no one owned because nothing but weeds would grow there, and anyone who tried to live on it would befall some terrible fate. It was said to be an ancient Native American burial ground. And the last incident was at the high school I attended. There was a hallway where a boy died from an asthma attack. It happened right by a closet between the newspaper room and the yearbook room. For security, all the doors in that school locked from the outside, but could still be opened from the inside. But if the door shut in that closet, you couldn't open it. They replaced the door, the doorknob, the lock, and even the frame several times, and it would still shut by itself and lock you in. It was a rule that if you had to go to that closet, that was storage for both yearbook and newspaper, you had to go in pairs, one person to make sure that the door didn't shut. Also, the lights flickered in the adjoining rooms constantly, after having the light bulbs, wiring, and circuits replaced many times. Those were the most circulated urban legends that I heard growing up. Not scary, but definitely strange. Next story. I'm an over-the-road truck driver, and I drive across all the lower 48 states. I see some unusual things from time to time, but nothing compares to what I encountered in Palestine, Arkansas in mid-June of 2011. It was a long haul from Detroit, Michigan to Houston, Texas. This was day 3 of my trip, and I was beginning to run out of driving hours for the day. I noticed a truck stop gas station on the side of I-40, pulled off, and decided to call it a night. I was running ahead of schedule, so I was going to have myself a long 14-hour break instead of the usual 10. Off the bat, I didn't like the area, but had no other choice. The bathrooms were unkempt and had enough graffiti on the walls to classify itself as an inner-city truck stop, even though it was practically in the middle of nowhere. It was also a small stop, with parking for only a dozen trucks. After washing up, I purchased a new work knife, some hot food, and headed out to my truck. I sat in the captain's chair and listened to the radio while I ate my dinner with the windows down, letting in the dry wind. The Mississippi River had just begun flooding, but there hadn't been any rain in over a week. The surrounding area was beginning to look like Nevada more than Arkansas. I finished my meal and cleaned up a bit. I slid out of the seat and onto the pavement as a gust of warm wind hit me. I strolled over to the dumpster, tossed my garbage inside, and began slowly walking back to my truck. I fished out a filterless cigarette and leaned against the bug-splattered side of my truck and lit it with my lighter. I enjoyed the smoke as I watched the sun set below the horizon. A few more trucks had backed into spots. I spotted one guy walking out of the store with a bottle of beer in his hand, looking around nervously as he quickly strode over to his truck. The life of a trucker. Something interesting and new every day, risking his job over one lousy beer. I climbed back into the cab of the truck, dropped back into the sleeper berth, changed into a pair of pajamas, and lay down to get some rest. I didn't bother setting an alarm. I felt sleep creep over me and accepted it as I drifted off into dream world. I woke with the cab of the truck rocking violently, knocking the bottle of water I had placed on my nightstand over into the floor. I sat straight up, fully awake, and pressed the button on the truck's radio alarm. It was shortly after 3 in the morning. I reached down and grabbed the bottle of water that had fallen, twisted the cap off, and took a few deep gulps before wondering what had rocked my truck so violently. Then I remembered the wind. I settled back down, got my heart rate back below 100, and lay my head down on the pillow. The truck rocked again, knocking my ashtray over that I had set in the cup holder, and once again tossing my water bottle onto the floor. I flipped on the overhead light, slid on my shoes, and grabbed another cigarette from my pack. I opened the curtain, sat in the captain's chair, and shut off the sleeper light. I opened the door and noticed that it had cooled down considerably. I shut off the truck, pocketed the keys, and climbed down onto the pavement to look around. At this time of night, the truck stop only had lights around the gasoline pumps, and their light could not reach the truck parking area. I looked around a moment, lit my cigarette, and then noticed something. The wind had stopped blowing. I wonder what had caused my truck to rock so violently. Earthquake, maybe? I knew that a few had been reported around Memphis, and I was probably close enough to have felt a tremor. But that rocking motion did not feel like an earthquake. It felt like the wind hitting the side of my truck with a strong gust. Curiously and cautiously, I walked around the front of my truck to the passenger side and looked down the length of my trailer. I noticed movement. Lowered to the ground about 4 feet. Not fast. I used my keys to unlock the passenger side door, jumped up and grabbed my large flashlight from an overhead storage compartment. I climbed back down and closed and locked the door. I clicked on the light and shone it down the side of my trailer. There was a young girl standing off into the field about 10 feet behind my truck. But when I looked harder, she wasn't there. Well, like I said earlier, truck drivers see something new every day. This was certainly new. I began to walk towards the rear of my truck, scanning the field with my flashlight for any trace of the girl I had just seen. When I reached the back, there was no trace. It must have been a trick of the eyes. Heck, I wasn't even fully awake yet. I glanced over my shoulder. There were no cars at the pumps, and the clerk definitely hadn't noticed me. I felt the call of the wild coming on and didn't feel much like walking into the store wearing my pajamas. I was in the middle of nowhere and no one could see me, so I figured no harm, no foul. I stood at the rear of the trailer and did my business, looking around for that girl again, also hoping that she wasn't hiding behind something and watching me do this. I put everything away and walked to the driver's side of my truck, toward the cab. I took the last couple of puffs off my cigarette and flung it into the parking lot, used my keys to unlock the truck, and popped the door open. Just as I planted my foot on the fairing, I heard a distinct giggle. A girl's giggle. I stepped back down and shone the flashlight around. Nothing. "This is getting kind of creepy," I said out loud. "He heard me," a small girl's voice answered back. I jumped backward away from my truck. The voice had come from inside the cab. Something was wrong. I had the entire truck locked up while I was walking around. There was no way that someone could have gotten in without breaking a window. Steeling myself for what was going to be an uncomfortable encounter, at the least, I took a step up on the fairing and leaned my head into the truck. "Is anyone in here?" I asked. I hit the switch to turn on the sleeper berth light. I climbed in. I put a knee onto the seat and peered into the sleeper berth. "Good night," a soft voice said, which seemed to emanate from all around me. I flinched as I heard the word and felt a cold chill run through my body. I slid off the seat and stood up in the cab, bumping my temple off the overhead storage bins. I looked around the sleeper. No one was there. I turned around and shuffled into the cab to close the door when I saw the young girl standing outside my truck on the pavement, looking up at me with lifeless eyes. Those eyes, you see, weren't meant for a person. They were designed for a predator, and all of a sudden I felt like prey. I reached forward and slammed the door shut and flicked the lock. I quickly decided that I was not staying here for the rest of the night. I turned the key and heard my truck's motor rumble to life, along with familiar annoying buzzing that was my air pressure gauge telling me that I didn't have enough air to release the brakes. I took a furtive glance out the window, and there she stood, still as a tree, looking up at me and smiling. I didn't want to get any closer to the window until I was ready to get my truck moving. This was wrong, and I didn't want any part of this. That girl wasn't human, at least not anymore she wasn't. It was almost as if she was something so inhuman that it would take the form of a human. It's hard for me to explain, and I feel sick just thinking about it. I heard a siren shut off and hit the valves to supply air to my brake system. As the system began to air up, the siren came on again. Screw this, I thought to myself. I've had enough, and I need to get out of here. I disengaged the clutch, grinded the truck into gear, and roared out of the parking lot like the devil himself was behind me, which for all I knew he was. I looked in my side mirror. I was about to start turning right and saw the girl washed in the red and amber glow of my running lights. She was smiling at me and waving. I flew through my gears as quickly as they would let me as I got back onto the interstate. I drove for about 45 minutes, repeatedly hitting the switch to turn on my interior lights to look around the cab and the sleeper before finally spotting a larger truck stop at the next exit. After backing into one of the few remaining spots left, I shut off my lights and turned on the sleeper berth light as I walked into the back, then paused. At the store, I had bought a souvenir. Nothing fancy, just a postcard with a picture of Arkansas on it. I also had bought a new knife. I'd never even taken the knife out of the box, and remembered putting the postcard into a drawer for safekeeping. The point of the blade had been driven directly into the spot on I-40 where I had originally stopped for the night. The blade had been driven in deep, pegging the postcard to my nightstand. It took me several minutes just to work the knife loose enough to withdraw it from the nightstand. Thankfully, when I turned the postcard over, no message had been left for me. To this day, I do not know what I saw. I hear the truckers talk of strange things that they see on the interstate, U.S. highways, and state routes, but I've never mentioned my experience. I've always felt that just by mentioning her, I'd walk back out to my truck and there she would be, sitting on my bunk, waiting for me. I threw that postcard away and tossed the knife into a dumpster. I got another postcard from Arkansas just to keep the collection going. I've got 36 so far. Next story. This is indeed a 100% true story. I made none of this up at all. So, my parents moved into a house in Elvia, Ohio, onto a street dubbed 10th Street just after I was born. This street seemed relatively normal, but the houses were also quite old and decrepit looking. The particular house we moved into was from the 20s and was sold for a very reasonable price, so of course it was natural that my parents would get it. They had no idea what they got themselves into. The first month or so was relatively quiet and had very few incidents or happenings which one would call out of the ordinary. However, going into the second month, things started getting strange. My baby monitor would have strange eerie noises go over it when I was fast asleep, and often windows would slam despite all of them being shut and locked in the house. This was only the start. By 3 months in, my parents were sure that the house was definitely haunted. During one experience, my mom was laying in the main bedroom with my father when a voice suddenly came over the baby monitor and said, "Oh look, a baby." Then, as if like clockwork, a toy horse turned up by itself in my room and started making its typical sounds and motions. This obviously freaked my mom out, but my father's experiences were inarguably worse. Every time he went out to the garage to work, he would turn on the radio to the metal station. Usually he loved listening to Pantera, Metallica, and all the late 90s metal artists. However, whenever he went in to use the bathroom and came back out, the radio had always, inexplicably, changed to country. He would always have to change it back. On top of that, he recalls that he would lay down some nights only to feel cold fingertips tuck him in nightly. Eventually my parents and my baby self got used to the haunting. We all had lived with it for quite a while and had learned to adapt. This was about a year in and I had just experienced my first birthday. We thought we had it all figured out. I didn't even get scared anymore whenever I saw something. However, my parents and I couldn't prepare for what was to come. The haunting got exponentially worse. My father recalls waking up one night to a dark shadow dashing down the hallway. He tried to wake up my mother, however, she didn't wake up in time to see the apparition. On top of that, I started taking a real notice to things which were happening. I was a fairly smart child. By one, I had a fairly good grasp on my environment and didn't ever lie or embellish. Kind of hard for me to lie when all I could really say was mom, dad, and toilet. The following text is still remembered vividly by me, despite my age at the time. It thoroughly scared me for life when an image of the ghost. I was playing with my toys on the floor in the living room. Now the living room had a clear view of the kitchen and you could see to the back area of the house. When I was playing, I saw a lady, entirely colored blue as if she were colorized, come curtsying out of the kitchen towards me. She had been dressed in a very old and fancy-looking dress. Perhaps she was going to a prom or something. She looked like a teenager, so perhaps she died young. I got the attention of my parents. However, they did not notice her before she faded out of existence. I also had another similar experience when I was almost 3. In the basement of the house, I had a small playhouse I used to always play in while my father was doing laundry. One time, I went to enter my house, but when I looked in, I noticed there was a man sitting there, translucent. I told my father, "There's a man in there. Make him leave," with the best language my young mouth could sputter. My father was dumbfounded as he looked in. There was no one inside my house anymore. I thanked Dad, went into the house, sat down, looked up, and the man was sitting there staring at me with cold eyes. I ran out of the basement as fast as I could. On top of this, there were a few times when I saw red eyes peering out at me from the aforementioned basement. I remember these things vividly. They simply terrified me that much. There were other stories, but it would take too long. But when I think about it, I'm really glad that eventually we did move out of that house. Next story. A group of friends were staying at this remote cabin that was one of my friend's cousins owned. There were no roads leading to the cabin, and it was a good 3/4 day hike from where you parked the cars. I couldn't go at the same time as everyone else due to work obligations, so I decided to head up the same day, but later. It would mean I would have to camp for a night by myself, though. The latter part of the trail is too dangerous to be taken at night, especially by someone who didn't know it. I didn't care. I was kind of looking forward to it as I'd never camped alone before. So I was in the middle of these woods when the sun went down. I got my camp set up in a small clearing, probably 40 feet across. I got my campfire going and pitched my small one-person tent. I did all that camping stuff like cooking hot dogs on a stick over the fire and s'mores. I probably stayed up for a good 2 or 3 hours after dark. It was mid-autumn, so the days were somewhat short. The entire time I thought I heard something or someone moving in the woods on the edge of the clearing. I didn't think anything of it at first because the woods are full of animals. But as the night went on, I realized that whatever it was just circling the clearing over and over. Once I started paying attention, it made me 4 or 5 laps around before I decided to get up and investigate. The noises stopped as soon as I stood up, and I thought I heard something going away through the woods. I just shrugged it off, thinking it was some fox that was curious that got scared when I stood up. I decided it was time to sleep. I doused the fire and climbed into my tent. I started to doze off and stayed in that half-asleep, half-awake state for a while. I normally hear weird stuff when I'm in this state, so I didn't think much of it when I heard a voice. Something woke me all the way up through, and I realized the voice was real and right outside my tent. It was just above a whisper, and I'm not sure if it was another language or if they were speaking English in such a way that I couldn't understand. I lay there for some time. I don't know how long, listening and waiting for something to happen. There's just enough moonlight to light up the walls of the tent, so I could see when a hand pressed into the wall of my tent down near my foot. This freaked me out, and I sat up quickly. Whoever was outside of the tent tore ass out of there, like running full sprint through the woods. I got out of the tent, shone my flashlight around, but saw nothing. I was expecting there to be a bloody handprint on the tent, but nope. Didn't sleep that night, packed up camp at first light that morning, and booked it to the cabin.